My name is Sean Jones, and I'm from Arizona State University. And I want to provide you a few additional comments as we step back for a moment about the challenges the pharmaceutical industry faces. Hopefully that'll help you frame the debate as synthetic biologists. So what I wanted to start out by saying in the next 10 minutes is that the pharmaceutical industry today is as challenged as it has ever been. But it's not just because of the newness of the information age and the concomitant and overwhelming deluge of information, although it is affecting our baths. It is because of something else. It's because of the coming era in healthcare and the many, many challenges. Unprecedented change, we've heard that a lot, but there are a lot of new technologies, a lot of new interrelationships, a lot of new competitive pressures. So it's not just because of the information age. It is also because of the challenge that pharma faces with navigating new landscapes of participant networks. Pharma also has to succeed in a safety-first world. Pharma also has to understand the impact and the import of the industry with regard to biosecurity in the global commons. So there are a lot of things going on that pharma has to deal with, not the least of which are some of these stark realities. And they are inescapable realities for the industry as a whole. And these sorts of realities drive all kinds of different organizational transitions, some of which you see here. Many of these are well known to you. And these organizational transitions, of course, may require new models, new ways of doing business. And there are many of those out there. Some of them are virtual models. But the point is that the traditional structure, the traditional organizational structures and the traditional business models are under progressive challenge. And I think that that's probably apparent to everyone here. So the urgent imperative, the drivers for all of this, are really the same for pharma. It is the delivery of efficient and equitable health care. Whether or not you believe in this trinity, which is often used, is a subject of a different discussion, but there are these urgent imperatives for the pharmaceutical industry. And unfortunately, they're very real, and they're no laughing matter. In the U.S. alone, diabetes in 2007 cost $174 billion. 1 year, $174 billion. So, underlying these new imperatives are new dimensions that are circumscribed in part by mashups of things like systems biology and network pharmacology. So it's no longer sufficient to discern small molecule ligand interactions of limited scale. You have to fathom, and fathom very deeply, networks. In fact, you have to fathom networks of networks of networks of networks of, well, you get the idea, right? So these networks are everywhere, whether they're in inner space, as we think about life sciences and the biology, or they're in food webs or knowledge webs or social networks. And not only these networks everywhere, they're soon to be connected to everything. And this has an impact on a lot of the technologies, the diagnostics, the in-home care, et cetera, et cetera. So, having said all of that, the strategic environment for the pharmaceutical industry is and remains, in the main, still recognizable, which is demonstrating therapeutic value. That's what they have to do at the end of the day. And it's the demonstration of therapeutic value with some new twists. And the hoped-for outcome of these new twists is all the right stuff, right? Right diagnosis, right? These are all recognizable? No, everybody's asleep. Okay, well, we'll keep going. So there's clearly a lot of opportunities. And featured prominently in those opportunities are those for synthetic biology, some of which are, a subset of which are noted here, as part of a broader landscape that's well known to this audience. So there's a lot of things that synthetic biology, broadly described, can be applied to. But we mustn't lose focus on what is really important to the pharmaceutical industry, which is the challenge of addressing inefficiency, waste, and risk in therapeutic selection. Okay, that was supposed to be funny cartoons, maybe not. Okay, toolkits. I've heard a lot of discussions at the conference in the last day and a half about component lists and toolkits. Fascinating discussions and appropriate, rightly so. But I'd ask something different of you, which is that given the the extraordinary potential excursion and import of synthetic biology. And there's a variety of different sectors here that one can imagine synthetic biology insertions. I would ask you to think, in addition to toolkits and parts lists, about compelling scenarios you could create that take all of the technologies that you know, all the technologies around you, in fact, which you are creating, and combine them and converge them and find something new that emerges from them. So this is an important concept, which is taking the various threads of technology today, looking at how they combine, converge, and the new things that emerge. And there's a lot of stuff out there to consider in this. There's a lot of, again, things well known to you. If you have any questions, ask them or don't. But in any case, the point I wanted to make is to look around you, take the technologies that are converging, leverage them, and try to come up with new combinations that are apropos to synthetic biology. This goes beyond the various prefixes of bioinfo, nano, robo, cogno. This is actually finding things apropos to synthetic biology. Because there's a lot of cool stuff out there, and there's a lot of stuff that's a lot of different ways to use it. And there's some even cooler stuff coming along, really cool stuff, maybe sort of science fiction or science in fiction, and even cooler stuff, and some neat ways to use it to inspire others. For those of you who don't recognize this, this is a reference to Will Wright's new game called Spore, which has an extraordinary amount of potential if you were to infuse it with some of the real-world formulaic knowledge that's available today in synthetic biology. Okay, so why should you bother? Well, you should bother because you can change the rules. You can catalyze extraordinary change. In fact, some of you in this room probably already are. The changes will be profound. They'll be far-reaching. And they may even progress to the point of answering some age-old questions, although the classic what is life is still beyond reach, I suspect, even for synthetic biology. So this is simply a slide to say you're not alone. In fact, you're in really good company. And I would close by saying, stretch those inspirational horizons and continue to reach to infinity and beyond. So history will judge whether you get it right. But certainly acknowledge the luminaries that have gone long before. It's also important to acknowledge the luminaries that have gone just a short time ago. And of course, remember that sufficiently advanced technology really is indistinguishable from magic. And as I said, reach to infinity and beyond. Thank you.
Within Merck, so I work for Merck Serono, and the short answer is no. We don't really have I have tried to get them interested, and what has recently happened within my company is that we essentially merged two equal-sized drug companies, and within my unit we had a protein engineering technology which was fairly advanced for its time. It was developed by in the late 1980s, which consisted of antibody cytokine fusion proteins for cancer treatment. And even though this was developed almost 20 years ago, or conceptualized, and the initial work was done about 20 years ago, the other half of the company that we merged with felt that it was too complicated. And they didn't like the idea of having to deal with the complexity of a drug that consisted of both an antibody and a cytokine, and you had to match the activities, and you had to figure out what is the ratio of activities of these two parts, and how are you going to optimize that. With the traditional drug development paradigm, everybody likes to think in terms of just having a molecule that binds to a target, and then you make it bind better, and that it's automatically better. And as soon as you get to something that has multiple activities, then it basically goes outside of the comfort zone of the pharmaceutical industry. And the result is that we don't have a synthetic biology unit, and we are even retreating from complicated engineered proteins. We do have a vaccine unit that is contemplating, for example, salmonella-based vaccines that present cancer antigens, similar to what Dr. Tian said about SARS or HIV, that you can have a bacterium that expresses a viral antigen. You can also have bacteria that express cancer antigens. And that's something that we've essentially dabbled with and haven't really made much progress with. Yep.
So
you guys can come up here if you want.
following up on the same question, is there synthetic biology at other pharmaceutical companies right now?
To the best of my knowledge, no. And one of the things that I mentioned briefly in my introduction is that there's an institutional resistance. There was a big, a little story that I'll tell you about Merck and Co., the big American drug company that was regarded for many years as the most admired company in the U.S. They had their big ivermectin program where they shipped a drug to cure river blindness to Africa, and they were a huge success, very ethical company, and now they've basically fallen on hard times. They made a strategic decision in the mid-1990s, or before that, early 1990s, not to go into protein drugs. And part of the reason for that is because the people who really ran the company were chemists. And the people who run biotech or drug companies now are either chemists or molecular biologists. They are not synthetic biologists. There is just institutional resistance to doing something like that because the people who run the companies don't have an interest in synthetic biology. And there's a book that everybody should read to understand why this problem exists. It's called The Innovator's Dilemma, and the basic thesis of this book is that once a company gets to be a certain size, it simply cannot remake itself. And the people within the company, people think of companies as almost as if, inaccurately, almost as if they have free will and that they make decisions based on rational economic considerations. And that's just absolutely not true. Companies are full of individuals with competing agendas, which are often not the same as the interests of the company as a whole. And so a company like mine, my company is fairly sophisticated, but there is still, every individual decision maker has an agenda which is protecting their own position. And so if you work on proteins or you work on small molecules, no matter what you work on, you're not working on synthetic biology. You made your career thus far by doing protein drugs or small molecules. And so you have no personal interest. You have nothing personally to gain. Your bonus is not going to get bigger if you introduce synthetic biology into the company. And I think the only mechanism is really to have startup companies who have as their agenda doing synthetic biology, doing the kinds of things that Chris Anderson or Jingdong Tian are doing. It's very difficult to get those going in traditional big pharma. Yeah?
Does the concept of pharmacogenomics and personalized medicine, does that scare big pharma? Does it narrows the market?
Yes. There's been a huge amount of hand-wringing about pharmacogenomics, and within my own company and within other companies, I've heard these discussions which say we don't want to do pharmacogenomics because it's going to narrow our market. And this, I will say, it comes from the marketing people who want to just expand the market, and it's fundamentally a very unethical argument, because what you're saying, in essence, is we don't want to do pharmacogenomics and find out who our drug is going to apply best to, because there are some people to whom it might not apply, but we would still like to sell those people our drug. And so it's a very problematic argument. And what has happened, though, is that the FDA in the U.S. has caught on to this and is now essentially saying, we really insist that you do this. It's somewhat difficult to enforce, but the other thing about pharmacogenomics is that it can give you an advantage if there's an established drug on the market. And there was actually a case study in terms of the statins, which are anti-cholesterol drugs. There's a family of them. There was an initial one on the market, and then another one, and then a particular statin that was, I think, the third on the market. The company in question did a pharmacogenomic analysis and found that a certain subgroup of people responded best to their drug. And so even though they were third on the market and they already had to overcome the established market share that the other two drugs had, the fact that you could give someone a test and say, we know that you are the right kind of person for this specific drug, that gives you a marketing advantage. And so if you want to invade a market that other people have established, then pharmacogenomics actually gives you an advantage. Yeah?
Just change the subject. The biopharmaceutical processing industry, which is a major part of pharma, clearly must be looking at synthetic biology as a way to try and rationalize some of the manufacturing production. That's something that we haven't really. So the question was, what about synthetic biology just for manufacturing purposes? And that's something that we haven't really touched on here, and maybe we take for granted, because that at some level has always been part of the industry. When people made antibiotics, even they were essentially doing synthetic biology as well as one could do it. Do you think they'll move over to adopting a more rational based kind of strategy for some of the designs, or are they just going to do it as they've done it?
I think.
I know, like, Amyris, before they became biofuels, they were seriously considering a business model of de-risking drug candidates that otherwise wouldn't be of any interest to a pharmaceutical company by synthesizing them in the biosynthetic pathway.
Right.
But in the biotherapeutic arena, there are stacks of biotherapeutics that are manufactured in CHO cells or
Right.
cell factories. And there are lots of people doing lots of stuff, which is really interfacing closely with what some aspects of synthetic biology are trying to do.
Yeah. So about manufacturing, I could rattle off some numbers that when you manufacture, there are two extremes of, if we're talking about antibodies or protein drugs, there are two extremes. One is the antibody, which acts essentially like a small molecule in that it inhibits the function of its target, and so you need to have at least a 1-to-1 molar ratio of the drug and the target, or a molar excess of the drug to the target. And so when somebody takes an antibody, for example, against a cancer antigen, you need to give that person a few hundred milligrams up to a gram of that antibody. And that's fairly expensive to manufacture, but at the end of the day, the way the numbers work out, when you're in manufacturing mode, it's about $300 a gram to make an antibody in mammalian cells. And then you charge a couple $1,000s. The manufacturing cost is always less than 10%. And the other extreme is something like erythropoietin, which costs $1,000 a dose, or $800 for plain erythropoietin and $1,200 for the new long serum half-life version. It costs less than 10 cents to manufacture that. Okay, there's a 10,000 to 1 manufacturing cost to retail sale price. All the expense of the drugs is in the clinical trials, the research, and the marketing. Manufacturing, even for protein drugs that are fairly sophisticated, is usually varies from minor to really insignificant. So the answer there is no. People don't care about synthetic biology because they're making so much money that manufacturing is not an issue. They are worried about whether the drugs work at all. That's more of a serious issue. One thing I would like to elaborate that Sean Jones started to talk about, and I don't know how much everybody in the room is aware of it, but the pharmaceutical industry really is in a state of crisis. It's doing terribly. And this should be a motivation to get interested in synthetic biology. I think what is apparent to people who are thoughtful about the industry is that probably a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, that things to which you can make a small molecule inhibitor have been mostly identified, maybe, and also things to which there's a finite number of things that you can do with antibodies. There's a finite number of naturally existing hormones and cytokines that the body makes that you could just give back to a person. It's not a very long list of proteins, for example, like erythropoietin or like human growth hormone, where a person is just deficient in this one naturally occurring protein. You make it, and then you give it back to that person. There is a lot that could be done with much more specific or sophisticated therapies that simple-minded drugs will simply never, ever do. And the pharmaceutical industry probably needs to be replaced, basically, by companies who are willing to do these kinds of things. And I think, the revolutionary aspect of synthetic biology basically involves an infusion of math and engineering principles that traditionally molecular biologists didn't do. And so what you don't see in molecular biology is everybody becoming synthetic biologists. You see a subgroup of people who have already been interested in math and engineering and are predisposed to have that bent going into synthetic biology, but you don't see wholesale adoption. And similarly, in the pharmaceutical industry, we're just used to doing things a certain way, and the way that that's going to change is that new companies are going to be formed. It's very difficult for an existing company to really change itself. And I think the other book that probably everybody's heard of, but not that many people actually seem to read, is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which talks about paradigm shifts. And it's something that gets used all the time in business motivational seminars. But what they don't tell you, but you have to read the book to find out, is that when there is a paradigm shift, what actually happens is that people who were following the old paradigm get old and die, and they don't shift their paradigm. What happens is new people come in who are outsiders to a given field. They're either young people or they're people who are not in the field and come in laterally, but the people who are in the field where the paradigm stops working don't shift to the new paradigm. They just get old and die, and they get replaced. And that, unfortunately, for the pharmaceutical industry, may be what is going to happen. And if you look closely at the pharmaceutical industry, you can see that happening now. There's kind of a slow death where companies, they don't obviously die. They don't go out of business like Lehman Brothers. They don't, fantastically implode. But what does happen is that their market share gradually shrinks, and then they merge with each other. And so there's this slow shrinkage that is disguised by the fact that you stay the same size, but that's because you merge with somebody else, and then you shrink a little bit gradually over time, and then you merge with someone else. And so all the companies are the same size, or they even appear to be getting bigger, but really what was one company, somebody once showed at a drug company meeting, showed a lineage diagram for Glaxo. And in 1960, there were 17 companies that all ultimately became Glaxo. And that's because all of those companies were gradually losing market share and needed to merge to remain viable. So I think synthetic biology really does offer an opportunity to kind of rescue the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, but it's not clear that the existing companies are really going to take advantage of it.
It could also be a model in which new startup companies do development of the drug, the sort of engineering of the organism that is the drug, and take it through phase 1 and phase 2, and it's a partnership with existing big pharma to do the rest of the work.
Right. So what Chris just said is it's kind of what has become the traditional model of biotech and big pharma function. The biotech companies have the visionary concepts, they do the initial development, and then they don't really have the desire or economic wherewithal to do phase 3 clinical trials, which are very expensive, and to do marketing, which is intellectually antithetical to what scientists like to do anyway. And so you could have that. You could have that go on right now with synthetic you could have synthetic biological biotech companies that then license their product to big drug companies. And I think synthetic biology is not far enough along that's not really happening now. But I will also say that that's harder. Being on the other side, working for a big drug company, the dynamic that happens is that there is an internal research staff that is almost always threatened by new developments because, and there's always a tension between the internal research staff, which basically wants to stay employed, even though it may not be that productive, and the sales and marketing people or the business development people who are always looking at the bottom line and realize the research people are not producing enough to fill the pipeline. And so the business development people will find, they will find a bacterium that is curing cancer or supposed to cure cancers. And then they go to the research people and say, well, this looks cool, but we're not scientists, we can't really evaluate it. And the scientists say, oh, it sucks because what we're doing internally works much better. And so there are all these dynamics that go on within big drug companies that actually make it somewhat difficult for the real innovations to get absorbed by big drug companies. Eventually it will happen, but it is tough for reasons that a lot of people don't realize.
In past, a lot of research has already been done on phage therapy.
Yes.
And does pharmaceutical companies have any interest in that kind of thing?
This is phage therapy for bacterial treatment, for treatment of infection, you mean?
Yeah, so there are a lot of papers which says in Russia a lot of phage research was done on phage therapy, but because of pharmaceutical companies' financial interest, that really didn't become popular in the West. But now, since resistance to older pharmaceuticals is increasing day by day, there are reports that they want to look into the phage therapy, which was developed quite a while ago.
Right.
So are the companies interested in that type of thing, or is just a hypothesis?
The short answer is no. I don't know if people are familiar with what the questioner is talking about. So phage therapy basically consists of using bacteriophages to treat bacterial infections instead of antibiotics. And I think the real reason that was not pursued in the U.S. was partly not so much because it was not profit. It was not really a question of the capitalist drive for profits, I think, so much as being outside of the comfort zone of the people who are in drug companies. These phages were not chemicals. There were questions. When you have a phage therapy, one issue with that phage therapy is knowing whether it's going to work or not. With an antibiotic, you essentially know, you have broad spectrum antibiotics, which is why people like them. And with a phage, generally it's fairly specific to one type of bacterium, and so there's a whole typing question. There's a kind of a pharmacogenomics issue of what is the bacterium that is really causing the disorder, and will this particular phage cure it? And you may need thousands of phages. You may need just a large number of very specific magic bullets, which if you could get that to work, it would be better, because you could attack some bad bacterium with a phage and not disturb the rest of the bacterial ecosystem in a person. That it would be an ideal kind of therapy, but I think it's actually kind of difficult to implement. But also there is this issue that it's just outside of the comfort zone of people in drug companies. And also, I to be honest, I haven't followed it in detail, but I do suspect that it may just be difficult to put it into practice. Otherwise, it may have gone farther in Russia. It didn't become a big deal in Russia or Poland, where people were really studying that kind of approach. So we're kind of running out of time. Let me ask one question of the audience. Are you guys happy with the way the drug companies are functioning? What do you think we ought to do? It seems. Do you think synthetic biology holds the answer, or what holds the answer?
I think you've identified it yourself. You have this internal tension in large pharma, which are very prone to not wanting to adopt new technologies, new approaches. And I think there is a real problem of trying to get young, innovative technologies into these huge oil tankers that take years to change direction. I think So ultimately, the industry is going to have to fragment, hopefully. At some point, and big pharma should do what they do best, which is marketing, drug manufacturing, making this stuff at the right scale, and doing all this sort of very expensive late-proof trials, basically.
Right.
Don't get involved in the development.
Okay. Okay, so your assignment is to start these companies.
Yeah, that seems to be something that I have a bunch of friends at Genentech, and I think of Genentech as being one of the healthier companies right now.
Right.
But if you look at the research in the antibody area, the protein engineering side, it's really narrowly focused, and it's so heavily invested in a particular approach to a particular type of therapeutic that to even say go towards a different type of protein as your target.
Yeah.
It's outside of the scope of what they would even consider doing. So it's like saying where you have to have a brand new company.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I'll get to your question in a sec, but I just have to say one of the disappointing things about the biotech industry is if you look at the first biotech companies that were founded, like Genentech and Amgen, which were incredibly successful, they have just turned into big pharmas, pretty much. They are not fast-moving. They are better than a lot of the other big pharmas, but they're not that much better. They suffer from a lot of the same institutional problems, and there are some serious institutional problems resulting from size and resulting from the dynamic of how people function within large hierarchies. Yeah.
I think your question was, are you happy with the pharmaceutical industry?
Uh-huh.
And I think mine was more of a comment. It's the challenge pharmaceutical companies face with, I think, healthcare delivery systems that I am curious to see how this science will change the pharmaceutical industry and its delivery into healthcare systems. If it's even possible for that to occur with this science. Because I think that's the major problem with the pharmaceutical industry is its delivery.
Yes, that's true. That's
so
true.
That was just my comment more than a question.
Okay.
Does pharmaceutical industry, if they themselves don't want to or cannot do this type of research because of various reasons, can they fund this type of research in universities or research centers so that if they are not developing or doing this or like very risky research, somebody else can do that for them?
Okay, the short answer is in principle yes, and in practice no. And it gets back to the thing of within a pharmaceutical company, it's just full of individuals, all of whom have their own agenda. And so let's say you are some person in a pharmaceutical company and you have control over enough control over the budget that you can sponsor some research in a synthetic biology lab. So I'm in EMD Serono and I could fund Chris Anderson's research and maybe we get some rights. Maybe we get an option to license if something good comes out. And so why don't we do that? And the basic reason is if I have enough control over the budget and I do something like that, I'm only going to get in trouble. It might end up helping the company 10 years down the road when the drug finally goes to market, but by then I may have quit, I may have died, I may have gotten old, or I may have shifted into sales and marketing. But in the short run, it will only cause me headaches because I am essentially threatening the careers of my friends who are within the company and who have a lot more say over how I'm doing politically within the company, what my bonus is going to be, and so forth. And there's really no upside for someone to go and do that. And so if you look at the sponsored research that drug companies do, they will sponsor research that is really essentially more like outsourcing. They will find an academic lab who is doing something that needs to be done that just involves a specialty that the drug company can't do quickly at the moment. They really don't use academic labs as incubators for creative ideas. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly how that's going to change because a lot of it's driven by human nature. Yeah?
So what are the, how does pharmaceutical companies adopt new technologies? What are the previous historical data?
Well, they adopt new technologies. Well, the answer is new companies start. Yeah?
I challenge what you said a little bit. If you look at it on the chemistry side.
Okay.
If you make the analogy as the chemists play the role of the synthetic biologist in the current industry, in the sense that, if we're talking about making bacteria as therapeutics, the people that we're hiring to make the drugs themselves are the people in the lab doing genetic engineering, just like the chemists are doing reactions. And the pharmaceutical industry is very supportive of chemistry departments.
That's true.
In developing chemical methodologies.
That's true. And I think they are. That's true. I don't know if everyone heard what he said, but basically, the pharmaceutical companies are supportive of things like the artemisinin work. They like stuff like that. They like the idea of using bacteria and microbes as chemical factories because it supports chemical-type drugs that they're used to selling.
The whole field of photosynthesis and organic chemistry only exists because it's the type of research that the pharmaceutical companies like their employees to have done as a graduate student.
That's true. Yes. So there is some support, but for synthetic biology, but not for real synthetic biologics as therapeutics. Really, for manufacturing purposes, there actually is a lot of support.
I guess I could see a scenario in the future, though, where you have a base of companies that are selling therapeutic agents, engineering base, you could have that same sort of relationship between academia and industry, where there is just general sponsorship of projects because they create the individuals that then show to the companies and bring in products.
Right. Okay. Well, it's a little after 3:30. I hope everybody enjoyed the session. Thank you. And we'll see you at the posters. And thanks to you guys for helping me.